Mark chapter 10, we're going to read verse 45 to begin with. For even the Son of Man came not to serve, but to be served, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This verse stands as a very succinct description of the purpose of Jesus' incarnation. Now, there are two specific things I want to consider at the outset this morning. Notice that it says that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. This word serve is defined as to be an attendant or assistant, to minister to relieve, to assist, or to supply with the necessities of life. That's what I want you to pay attention to supply with the necessities of life, to provide the means of living. Those latter two things capture most the idea of the way in which Jesus came to serve, to supply the necessities of life and to provide the means of living for mankind. Then it says, and to give his life as a ransom. And that's the next thing I want to consider, that word ransom. This word ransom is defined as a price paid, or the cost, for securing freedom and release for someone who is a captive or a hostage. We have to keep in mind Romans chapter 6 and verse 23 that says, the wages or compensation of sin is death. And so what this is suggesting is that Jesus had to come and pay a price, pay a ransom, to secure the opportunity for individuals' deliverance from that bondage to sin, from that appointment with death, or the second death, as it were. And so in that sense, his life was a ransom. He came to serve, and he came to be a ransom. And so what we see in Jesus is that he lived a sacrificial life. The whole point in his coming, the reason for him living the way that he lived and doing the things that he did and experiencing what he experienced and end the way it ended, was to accomplish those specific things, to serve mankind, to provide the necessities to man so that man might have life, to provide some means of living for us, and to pay our ransom. Sacrificial life. It wasn't lived for himself. He didn't benefit from it. He didn't gain anything by it. He offered it for us. If we follow Jesus, then we follow a life of sacrifice. That's the way that we too should live. That's the way that we should view our lives. That's the purpose for which we should have for doing and saying what we do and say, and the attitude with which we should face this life. We want to take a few moments to begin with to look at a record of Jesus' sacrifice. And we're going to draw primarily from Luke, the 22nd chapter. We're going to look at several excerpts from Luke 22. Now, we could really draw from his entire lifetime, but the culmination of his entire lifetime is encapsulated in the things that we are going to look at and take the time to look at this morning. We want to start looking at verse 47. We're going to read from about verse 47 to 54 in Luke 22. It says, while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. And he drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out against me as a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour in the power of darkness." They seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house, and Peter was following at a distance. So first we see this initial encounter with this mob who comes to take hold of him and arrest him, and his disciples ready and willing and armed and able to fight, and he says, "No more of this." We learn in another place that he could have called the myriads of the angels out of heaven to come to his defense as well. He had the ability to stop what was taking place, but that wouldn't have accomplished his sacrificial life. It wasn't his purpose to stop what was taking place. But it's important that we note what he displayed to everyone, that he had the power. Because when the sword was drawn and Malchus's, the high priest servant, his ear was lopped off, Jesus took that ear and restored it to his head. There can be no doubt about the power of the Lord. And everyone there witnessed that power. Everyone saw that he was able to restore that ear. And that was a demonstration that though some might look at the situation and think that he was not in control, he in fact was absolutely in control. And they could all see it and know, if their eyes were open, if they were willing to think. In verse 63, the story picks up, "Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, 'Prophesy, who is it that struck you?' They said many other things against him, blaspheming him. This is the same one who just put an ear back on the side of a man's head. He didn't have to put up with this. He didn't have to deal with his creation making fun of him. He didn't have to deal with being beaten. He didn't have to deal with being blindfolded and blasphemed. But he did. Because it wasn't about him. You know what most of us would have done? We would have fought back. We would have tried to defend ourselves. We would have answered the things that were being said. We might have even tried to fight back and prevent these things from happening. Jesus didn't do that because it wasn't about him. What he was doing was about man. Making himself a ransom for men. Serving men. Providing the necessities of life to men. Chapter 23, let's go back to chapter 22, verse 66. "When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. They led him away to their council and said, 'If you are the Christ, tell us.' But he said to them, 'If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God.' So they all said, 'Are you the Son of God then?' And he said to them, 'You say that I am.' Then they said, 'What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips.'" Blasphemy. That's the charge. That's the problem. He's made himself equal with God. That's why they feel he's worthy of death. He was Emmanuel, God with us. He was not just the Son of God, but he was God the Creator. All things were made by him, and apart from him, nothing was made that has been made. He could have displayed his glory. He did on the Mount of Transfiguration to 3 of his disciples. But he didn't. He could have proven that he was the Christ. It should have been enough that they saw him put a man's ear back on his head. But he didn't, because it wasn't about delivering himself. It was about sacrificing himself, allowing himself to be spent to redeem a people and make a nation of priests. Chapter 23 and verse 13, the story picks up. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us." And so understand that the 2 Roman officials who were in charge of judging this matter both found no guilt. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Verse 16, I will therefore punish and release him. But they all cried out together, "Away with this man! Release to us Barabbas," a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A 3rd time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. You notice Jesus is silent through all this. And Jesus isn't pleading to Pilate, "You know I'm innocent. And Herod knew that I was innocent. And now you've said these 3 times that I'm innocent and I've done nothing worthy of death. You need to do what is right." He didn't do that. Because this wasn't about him. This wasn't about delivering him. This wasn't about preserving him. This was about him as a sacrifice. Remember where it all started? John was out teaching, and Jesus walked up, and John said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." The sacrifice. That's what it was about. And so he sat quietly. And he led a man who was so adamant that Jesus was innocent that he 3 times publicly said, "He has done nothing worthy of death. This man is innocent. He's not guilty of the charges you brought against him of. I am not going to do this. I am going to let him go." That man comes to the point that he finally gives in to the pressure of the crowd. And that's okay. Because it's not about delivering his life. He's offering it up. He's still in control. He still has the legions of angels in heaven at his disposal. He still had the ability to restore Malchus's ear. He could execute the authority of his divine nature at any point in time. But he didn't. Instead, he made a sacrifice of his life. He used his life for others rather than himself. We're going to turn for a moment to Matthew 27 to look at this next segment of this day. Matthew 27, we're going to read verses 26 through 31. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. The soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him, and they stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head, and they put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spit on him. They took the reed and struck him on the head, and when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify. Humiliating. Absolutely humiliating. The things that Jesus endured. He didn't come to his defense. He didn't put a stop to it. He didn't exercise his power and authority. He didn't demand that instead of mocking him in worship, they actually worship him. He let them do whatever they wanted to do, because it was not about him. And what we see in this process of what's going on, and why that first event that we looked at is so important in understanding that all of this that was happening was not things that were being done to Jesus outside of his ability to control or manage or stop or overcome. And so what we see here is that Jesus gave his own life. Nobody took it. He sacrificed himself. He offered himself as a sacrifice, as a ransom for men. John's Gospel in John chapter 10, starting in verse 17, the Scripture says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again." He was in control the whole time. Both in his death and in his resurrection, I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. That's important in understanding the sacrificial nature of Jesus' life. These things that he endured, this hatred, this humiliation, the beating, the mistreatment, the mocking, the scorn, the being spat upon, all of these things that he endured, he had the power to not endure them. He gave his life. He had the authority. He had the control. This charge I have received from my Father. I have the authority to lay it down. I have the authority to take it up. I am in control. Back in Luke's account of that day, verses 49 through 51, when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched the ear and healed him. This isn't a minor incidental record. It's a demonstration of his power in the middle of all of this manhandling and abuse of him, so that it would not be missed that the Roman soldiers were not in control, so that it would not be missed that the Jewish council was not in control, so that it would not be missed that the governors were not in, that Jesus was in control, that he had the power to stop what he wanted. You notice he turned to his disciples and he said, "No more of this." He stopped that. He stopped his defense. He stopped the ones who wanted to keep him from being arrested. He stopped the ones who wanted to stop him from being mistreated. And he stopped the ones who were going to stop him from going to the cross. No more of this. And then demonstrated his authority to make these choices by working a miracle in their presence. He put a man's severed ear back on his head. Can you imagine? Can you imagine seeing that and not understanding that he could have protected himself if he determined to do so? And so in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 6 it says, who gave himself as a ransom for all. Who gave himself as a ransom for all, which is the testimony given at the proper time. This whole thing is a testimony about the purpose of Jesus coming into the world to give his life as a ransom. It is a demonstration of the truth of the passage that we started with. That he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This was the testimony at the proper time. That he was using his life as a ransom. Going back to the Gospel of John, we see Jesus saying in chapter 10 and verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. In verse 15, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. In verse 17, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. Jesus was in control the entire time. His death was a sacrifice. It wasn't taken from him. His life wasn't taken from him. They weren't setting the tone. They weren't setting the timeline. They weren't setting what happened. All of that had been prophesied centuries before. Who would be ruling at the time was prophesied centuries before. How he would die was prophesied about centuries before. Who he would be was prophesied about centuries before. He was paying a ransom to secure penitent sinners' release from their captivity to death through sin. He was serving. And that's how he was doing it. He was doing it by giving up his life. By allowing people to mistreat him. By allowing people to hit him. By allowing people to spit in his face. By allowing people to mock him and make fun of him, by allowing them to nail him to the cross. I honestly can't imagine a more humiliating thing than to be publicly stripped. Did you miss that? That happened to our Lord? They stripped all of his clothes off of him, threw a scarlet robe on him, pretended to honor him as a king for a few minutes, then stripped him down again and put his own clothes back on him. How horrified would you be to be so treated? And he let it happen. Because he was paying a ransom to secure a means of life for you and for me and for any other man or woman who ever lives who is willing to come to him and allow this sacrifice to be applied to their life. Following Jesus, and that's what this series is about this year, following Jesus. Following Jesus means living as a sacrifice the way that he lived as a sacrifice. For you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. Living that kind of a life. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Listen, the world puts us in a position where we defend ourselves, we protect ourselves, we preserve our life. We don't let anyone misuse us and abuse us or make us look bad. But he says you need to have your mind transformed. You need to be renewed so that you're willing to use your life as a sacrifice for the needs and the well-being of the people around you rather than yourself. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, considering what Christ did for you, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. Do you know what that's saying? We need to live the same kind of life that Jesus lived. No longer concerned with preserving ourselves, but allowing ourselves to be spent and to be used and even abused if necessary, so that the needs of others may be provided. Forget for a while what others are doing, and suspend your mind for a moment about what's going on in the world. For the next few minutes, and maybe on into this afternoon, if you can focus and think about it long enough, forget about all the stuff. Forget about all the injustice. Forget about all the ugliness. Forget about what other people are doing. Forget about everyone else. The first and the only thing that matters for us in regard to all of those things is whether or not I am living a sacrificial life in the midst of it. And so that's the question I want you to focus on. The public airways are full right now of a discussion about what we should do to ensure and to provide and to protect ourselves and our rights. Forget about that for a minute. And ask yourself, am I following Jesus? Am I living as a sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is my reasonable service? Am I willing to suffer humiliation and hardship? Am I willing to be made fun of? Am I willing to have people think me a fool by proclaiming the glories of God, by demonstrating his righteousness, proclaiming his excellence among the people, and using my life not to build my reputation, not to protect myself, but using my life to proclaim his excellencies among the nations. For you are not your own, you were bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body. That's what that verse is about. It's about me being a sacrifice. It's about you being a sacrifice. It's about us not worrying about what other people think. It's about not worrying about what other people say. It's about not worrying about what other people do. It's about making certain that I follow the example that Christ left for me. Because if I do that at the proper time, God will exalt me. And no one can stop it. That mistreatment, the name calling, the spitting, the hitting, that's temporary. When God exalts you at the proper time, when God transforms you, when God brings you to heaven to be with Him, that's permanent. There's nothing on this earth, nor anyone, nor any power, nor principality anywhere else that can get in between us and the love of God. There is nothing that can stop that from happening except me giving in to the temptation to protect myself now rather than to follow Him in a sacrificial life. And it's a huge mistake when I let myself do it. By the way, in the interest of full honesty and confession, there are days that I do that I revert to trying to protect myself and defend myself and preserve my life. And when I do that, I'm wrong. I'm not following His example. I'm not being the kind of person that He would have me to be. And I'm not accomplishing His purpose. Glory doesn't come to Him because someone thinks something great about me. Glory only comes to Him when I reflect His righteousness in the world, when I speak His truth in the world. And when I suffer, in the way that Jesus put it, you got to take up your own cross and follow me. Don't know what that cross is going to be. For Jesus, it literally was going to the cross. For me and you, it's simply making our lives a sacrifice. That He might be glorified among men. Maybe your neighbor, maybe your friend, maybe your coworker comes to salvation because you live your life as a sacrifice. Maybe your husband or your child or your parent comes to salvation because you live your life as a sacrifice. And maybe you never see it happen. That doesn't mean it's not worth it. What should it profit a man if he should gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? It's worth it. It's worth living this way. With all of its challenges, with all of its difficulties, and with all of those days when you just don't really want to put up with it anymore. You know what you do? You do the same thing Jesus did. You pray. Give me the strength. Strengthen my soul. Allow me to bear up under this. Allow me to do what is right. And you let God be glorified. Though everyone around you think you a fool and naive, you let God be glorified. And maybe, just maybe, somebody is supplied the necessities to living by the sacrifice that you make of yourself. That's what God is calling us to do. If you're here